Hi, my name is JaeRan Kim, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Work and Criminal Justice at University of Washington, Tacoma. And thank you so much for attending this presentation today on the intergenerationality of Korean adoptee parents. This is a topic that's personally resonant for me because I'm a Korean adoptee. I was adopted in 1971 to Minnesota, and I'm also a parent. I have two children this is a picture of us when my kids were in Korea at ages 9 and 14. They're now 22 and 26. It's hard to believe. Um, so this study, Adoptees as Parents, Intergenerationality of Ethnic, Racial, and Adoption Socialization, is based on an analysis conducted by Zhang Zhu, Heewon Lee, and Richard Lee, all from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Zhu is now at Purdue University, and myself. And we have published an article on this. It is in Family Relations. So this analysis looked at ethnic socialization, racial socialization, and adoption socialization practices of Korean adoptees. And so what we mean by ethnic socialization is how do the Korean adoptees discuss their Korean heritage and being Korean and Korean identity with their children. In terms of race, we are talking about the ways in which these Korean adoptive parents were talking about Asian American uh, statuses with their children, and including things such as being proud of being Asian and also preparation for discrimination and bias because of their race. And then finally, we were looking at adoption socialization practices, which is the ways in which these parents talked about adoption with their own children. The intergenerational transmission of ethnic, racial, and adoption socializations may present unique patterns for transracial, transnational adoptee families compared to non-adopted or ethnic, racial minority families. This study really was conceptualized because Dr. Lee had done some research on Asian American parenting, and specifically looking at 1.5 and second generation Asian Americans, which Korean adoptees qualify as that. And some of them participated in that other study, but because of the uniqueness of having been raised by white parents and many of the aspects around race and ethnic socialization were quite different for them compared to second generation Asian Americans. And so this study was a way to look more specifically at those aspects around racial socialization practices for adoptees. So this study is, this analysis is based on the interviews with 51 Korean adoptee parents. And we asked them questions around how they were raised and how they are raising their children. Some of these were dimensions of just general parenting, such as how they were disciplined or what kind of expectations or communication they had in their adoptive families, as well as aspects around socialization of ethnicity, race, and adoption. The parents' age average was 40, just over 40 years old. They were adopted between 3.5 months to 10.5 years. Many of them were married, and 31 of them had white partners, 9 had Asian partners, and 8 had partners who were of other races. As a general sample, they were highly educated, they tended to have high incomes, and while they were drawn from all over the United States, they were mostly Midwest-based, and that makes sense because many of the researchers originated in Minnesota, and Minnesota has the highest per capita of Korean adoptees in the United States. These parents altogether, 5 of them had adopted children only, 5 had both biological and adopted children, and 42 had only biological children. In terms of themes and codes, these were organized in terms of past socialization practices, meaning what they received in their adoptive families, and how that looks compared to their present socialization practices with their children. In terms of ethnic socialization, one of the themes that emerged was that many of the adoptees had very limited exposure themselves, meaning that their parents did not provide a lot of ethnic socialization for them. this was arranged. There were some who had attended culture camps, language schools, or had experience with other Korean adoptee families or other Korean adults. But for the most part, many of them talked about having real limited exposure to their Korean culture. And what this meant is that in terms of their ethnic socialization practices with their children, many of them talked about not feeling authentic or going through a process of reculturation. So Marie here talks about not feeling authentic, and she was saying that one of the challenges being a Korean adoptee parent is that the cultural component does not come organically. It's not seamless, it's work. And she goes on to talk about how then she doesn't think about it, and then she feels bad that she hasn't done more active strategies around ethnic socialization with her children. Rebecca talks about both not feeling authentic and the reculturation aspect. So she says, you know, a challenge is being able to teach her, meaning her daughter, and help her grow up as part Korean with someone who myself has no knowledge of her Korean heritage. And then she says, I just started to figure it out myself, so there isn't too much for her to be able to pass on. And that she has to kind of think that make sure that they're learning together. And that was echoed by some other families as well. In terms of the racial socialization, one of the major themes that came out was that the adoptees talked about in their adoptive families that there was either blatant racism or there was a general sense of color blindness. And by racism, just a couple talked about racism towards Asians or towards themselves because of their Korean heritage, but more often it was comments that were made or behaviors that showed that there was some bias or prejudice against people of other races. By and large, there was a lot of adoptees who talked about the color blindness in their families, and what that meant was that they didn't talk about race at all. Or parents actively would say things like, we don't see race, we think everybody's the same, we don't see you as being Korean, you're just our daughter. As a result, their active parenting strategies around race really looked at how they can promote a multiracial, multicultural sense of celebration and recognition, and also that they were in some ways maybe more interested in dealing with racism than their parents were for them. And part of that has to do with recognizing their children with their racial identities. So, for example, Crystal was talking about how when she was growing up, her parents thought of her as white, and that she herself also thought of herself as white. And this lasted even up until she entered her 30s. Margaret, talking about how she's really promoting the multiracialness of her children, says that she tells her boys are like tri-flavored ice cream, a little bit chocolate, a little bit strawberry, and a little bit vanilla. And this is based on the fact that they're born in the United States, they have a Korean mom, and because they have an Indian dad. And then Deanna talks about the fact, for a lot of the adoptees who had partners who were white, that their children didn't necessarily look Korean. And so if they looked more white, then they were going to have some white privilege. And so Deanna here talks about how, because her kids don't look Korean, she has to talk to them about that, about the fact that they're not going to necessarily be identified as being Korean or Asian. And then in terms of adoptee socialization, the adoptees talked a lot about master narratives that their families shared with them, master narratives of adoption. And these were kind of these larger general, usually stories that helped them at the time feel good about the fact that they had been adopted, if they talked about the adoption at all. And for the adoptees as parents, then the theme that came up was some of them chose to talk about adoption, some of them did not talk much about adoption with their children. And then another theme that kind of came up around it was discussions around biological connections, either with birth families or to their children. Sam says that, you know, I was sold this very romantic narrative, like she, meaning Sam's birth parents, birth mother, couldn't take you, and then we found you, and you're our daughter. And that felt good when I was young. Ethan talks about how in his family with his daughter, they talk a lot about race, but don't talk a lot about adoption. And Ethan goes on to say that, maybe I'm not giving her enough credit, but I feel like it's really complicated. And Ethan's daughter was pretty young at the time, but I think it's very interesting that there was more of a recognition about racial socialization and less about adoption. And then Kristen talks about, on the other hand, being very proactive in talking about adoption with her kids. She says we talk about a lot about like what it means to have a family, and I tell her I'm adopted. I came from Korea. I don't know who my Korean grandparents are, or other extended family members. And then she says that her daughter also is interested in finding her Korean side of the family. And then another general theme that came up um, is around parenting as an adoptee. And this theme really speaks to the intersectionality of parenting. So it's not just parenting as a Korean adoptee or as a Korean person or just as an adoptee, but parenting as a Korean adoptee. And so Mia talks about when you parent as a Korean adoptee, you go through the whole adoption experience again. And this is somewhat parallel to the re-culturation, but a little bit different because here she's talking, and in Mia's case, she's talking about a child she had by birth, but she says that she still, when her children reach certain milestones or different events, it recalls similar feelings from when they themselves were a child. And so she says it's like experiencing the whole adoption process a second time. And many adoptees talked about when their children either were the age they were when they were placed in an orphanage or placed in foster care or placed with their adoptive family, that those brought up real particular feelings for them. And then Deanna talks about this strong feeling that she has and connection and maybe overprotectiveness. Some of the adoptees talked about it in terms of overprotectiveness. Um, and Deanna really articulates this well. She says, there's this thing inside me that says I have to remember this goodbye. I don't remember saying goodbye to my Korean mom. And then, so finally, some of the takeaways. It's important for us to acknowledge there was a real diversity of experiences and a diversity of socialization practices. Some were practicing very intentionally. Some discussed not feeling like their children were old enough yet or ready enough yet. And so it'd be very interesting to do some follow-up and see, now that we're 5 years after this data was collected and the children are older, have the parents implemented any different or more socialization practices. Many were parenting multiracial children, which I mentioned. And so Christine Wu, who is part of Dr. Lee's lab at the University of Minnesota, has written an article about multiracial parenting. It's just recently came out in Developmental Psychology. And then I'm analyzing and working on a manuscript right now about a smaller set of adoptees who have adopted and what their experiences have been like as adoptive parents and as adoptees. And then finally, one of the things that we would have really liked to have had is more fathers participate. We only had 3, and so it would have been nice to have been able to have more fathers share their perspectives. That's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for watching this. If you want any more information about these studies or these articles, feel free to contact me. I have my email here. You can also go get links to my articles at that bottom link there as well. And thanks so much.